we do in this paper is to analyze the joint effects of the risk of infection at the workplace and the risk of automation on employment, with a particular view on Austria, because we have Austrian data from the microcensus, a very large data set, at least for Austrian standards, on the evolution of employment depending on automatability and infection risk at the workplace. Now, the motivation for this paper is, I think, best presented in the next two pictures, where the first one is a car factory from 100 years ago. So it's actually a Ford factory. And we see that here production happens as we model it in economics, right? So we have human workers on the one hand, and they are along an assembly line, so the standard physical capital. And this very much resembles what we have in the Cobb-Douglas production function. So we have the two types of production factors, and there is complementarity in the inputs. So you need workers here to produce output. Without any humans, you cannot produce any output. And the second thing to note is that perhaps this is kind of the nightmare for virologists in a pandemic. You see a very crowded production hall, so many people in this production hall, no ventilation and so on. So it's very likely that one of these people would pass on a virus if they are infected to others. And so in a pandemic, there could be quite a lot of spread on the workplace in such a situation. Now, if we fast forward 100 years and Google modern car factory, then the picture that we would get looks very likely somehow like this one here, where we don't see any human workers. We see instead industrial robots that substitute for the workers. And we see basically two types of physical capital producing output on their own. So the first type is still this assembly line, and the second type are the industrial robots that substitute for the human workers. So for the first time in history, basically, it's really possible to produce output just with physical capital alone and without any human labor input. And the second thing is that since you don't see any workers here, infection risk in such a production facility would be comparatively low. And what we want to analyze now is kind of whether this exogenous increase in infection risk at the workplace that we've seen in the pandemic led to an automation push. And as I will argue later on, this has been denied mostly in the press, where they said, well, we don't see this increase in the number of industrial robots that you would need to see in this case. But actually what we argue is that perhaps looking only on industrial robots is a too narrow view, because there are many different forms of automation technologies. So the first one indeed is industrial robots, but that is very well or very suitable for the automation of mass production. But there are many other types of automation, for example, 3D printers, which are good at automating customized production. So for example, in the hearing aid industry, 3D printers are now standard, where previously you had a lot of workers and it was very labor intensive to kind of model the hearing aid and then model it in a way that it fits to the patient. And nowadays it's done that you scan the ear and send the scan to a 3D printer that prints the hearing aid. So 3D printers are another form of automation that is not captured by data on industrial robots. Another one is service automation, for example, self-checkout desks in supermarkets, although that's not really automation, it's more a shift of work away from the supermarket towards the customer, but nevertheless, it has an impact on employment. Right? And in the last couple of months, 1.5 years now, almost, we have all seen the potential of machine learning and AI in automation. So with ChatGPT and so on, but even before they emerged, writing reports, news flashes, and ads and so on was done by such algorithms. Diagnosing diseases has been shown to be doable by such devices quite efficiently, and even doing science. So in material science and in drug development, artificial intelligence is now employed on a large scale, and apparently, according to reports, makes the product or increases the productivity quite a lot in this area. So there are different forms of automation that we need to take into account when we think about this exogenous impact of the pandemic. Now, as far as the literature so far is concerned, there have been many papers analyzing the consequences of automation. So we have the consequences on productivity, where typically the papers show, so the most prominent ones are from Gretz and Michael, Susceptible and Restrepo, and Emu and Olson, they show that productivity increases if you use automation technologies and AI. With respect to employment, the picture is more differentiated. So Acemoglu and Restrepo for the US show that they reduce employment, but Dowd and co-authors use the same method as Acemoglu and Restrepo, but for Germany, and they don't find any effect. They find a shift away from manufacturing towards services, but at the aggregate level, they do not find an effect. So the loss of labor in the manufacturing sector is compensated by increases in employment in the service sector. And Mann and Büttmann use a very innovative way of showing that actually it could even be that there are increases in employment due to automation. So with respect to employment, the jury is still out. On inequality, most of the papers show an effect that inequality is increased because, at least up to now, it's easier to automate the labor that is done by low-skilled workers who have lower wages to start with, and therefore the wage distribution kind of so there is more dispersion in the wage distribution basically due to that. And the labor share has also been shown to be decreasing in automation, which was also kind of unanimous. Then Anna, you have contributed a lot to the effects of automation on fertility, and that's quite another consequence of automation that could emerge. And of course, through all these pathways, automation can have an effect on well-being. So on the one hand, you can produce more, consume more, that may increase well-being. On the other hand, you may be afraid of losing your job, or you may have lower wages and so on, and that may decrease your well-being. So here the jury is also still out. But there have been many, many contributions in the last couple of years on the consequences of automation. On the causes of automation, where we want to contribute with our paper, there is not that much going on. I mean, of course, it has been shown that technological change is a major driving force. So without the possibility to automate a certain task, so without the technological possibility, you cannot automate it. But this is only a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition, as others show, because a firm would not invest in expensive robots, for example, if it has cheap labor available. So you need kind of as another condition that it must pay off for firms to invest in automation technologies. And that's typically the case if there are high wages, for example, or if the labor market is tight. That has been shown in the literature that these two aspects play quite a strong role. And demographic change also, of course. So if the fertility rate is low, then the workforce growth is low, and you have fewer workers and therefore more incentives to invest in automation, and that also has been shown to play a role. What we want to contribute now is to analyze whether there is also a role to play for the pandemic and for viral transmission risk in this context. But before I go into the details here, there is a world map that illustrates actually all of the 4 points made on the previous slide, and that shows that density of robots, the robot density in the manufacturing sectors of all the countries in the world, basically, where we have the darker countries in terms of the blue color here, are the countries where robot density is higher, so where there are more robots, industrial robots per manufacturing worker. And the countries with the lighter blue color here, there are fewer robots. And then the white countries, there are no data, but that's basically synonymous with having almost no robots available. And what we see here is that indeed the countries that are at the technological frontier, so Northern America, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, they are the ones who are automating quite a lot. But within these countries, there are also differences. For example, you see this with the UK having a comparatively low automation density, and Japan and South Korea having a very high automation density. And the difference between these countries is not the technological level or the income level, but the demographics, right? The UK had a lot of immigration, and France had a comparatively high fertility rate, while Japan, South Korea, Germany, and Italy have very low fertility rates, and particularly Japan and South Korea have also very low immigration. So these aspects kind of can be visible in this graph, and we want to ask ourselves now whether there could be a role for a transmissible disease in this whole context. And the intuition behind this is that robots cannot be infected by at least biological viruses, right? So they can also not transmit the diseases. They do not go on sick leave, so there is no productivity loss, and they also do not suffer from long-term productivity effects, such as the long COVID syndrome. And all these reasons should actually imply that if a pandemic occurs exogenously, then this should raise the incentives to automate. And how we want to analyze this is now first to build a simple theory of the decision of firms to employ robots versus workers in the face of a pandemic. Then a pandemic occurs, and we want to look at the effects that this has on the decision of firms to automate. And then we test the three predictions of the theory with the Austrian employment data, where we have data before and after the COVID-19 pandemic on employment. And I will show data that we can differentiate this employment data between workers that are easier to automate and more difficult to automate, and workers that have a higher viral transmission risk at the workplace and a lower viral transmission risk at the workplace. Now, of course, if there are any questions, just feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I would now go into describing this theoretical model, and I will just keep very intuitive by doing so. But the next few slides will basically set out this model. Now, the first thing that we have here and that we introduce here is now a production function, where we have that output is produced with traditional physical capital. So that very much resembles actually the picture that we have here. So traditional physical capital is the assembly line, and then we have tasks along this assembly line, and these tasks have to be performed either by humans or by robots. So we allow basically for both of these production structures. We have the different tasks, and they can be performed by humans or by robots. And these different tasks are the XT omega, where we have J, uppercase J, different tasks that have to be applied along this assembly line, and the output elasticity is alpha. Now, if there is such a firm that produces output according to this production structure, the firm will have a demand for the different tasks that can be either fulfilled by an external firm or by an internal unit that supplies the tasks. But irrespective of whether it's an internal unit or an external firm, there would be an inverse demand function for these tasks. And that means that the firms producing this output would employ the particular task omega up to the point where the additional output, the value of the additional output it can generate by doing so, is exactly equal to the cost of this task. So what we get is that the price of the task will be the marginal value product of the task, and that's the derivative of this function with respect to xt omega. And we see this derivative is that alpha comes down from the exponent. All the other tasks drop out because they don't contain the task omega. So if we take the derivative, the sum drops out. And kt to the power of 1 minus alpha is still here. So we have the different assembly lines, where if you have more assembly lines in the economy or in the firm, then this would mean that the price for tasks is higher. The reason is you have more assembly lines and therefore more tasks to do along this assembly line. So this increases the demand for tasks, and this in turn increases the price of the tasks. And then we need to model the production of these tasks. And as I said, this could be an external firm or an internal unit of the firm that produces the task xt omega. And now we assume that the task can either be produced by human workers, that's LT omega, and humans have a productivity of ATL omega, and this depends on the infection risk at the workplace. If infection risk is higher, the productivity of humans would be lower because they go on sick leave or they suffer from long-term decreases in their productivity, or simply for the fact that if there are many humans in this production process, then a shutdown, a lockdown would lead to kind of a closing of the firm. But then we also have a second way of production, and that is if the robots or automation capital takes over the tasks. Automation capital is denoted by PT omega for programmable labor, if you will. And the robots or this automation capital has a productivity of ATP omega. And the crucial aspect is, of course, that ATP omega is not affected by the infection risk because robots are not infected. And then we raise this to the power of beta. So we just allow for a general production structure where the production function could be with decreasing returns or with or could be a linear production function with constant returns. it doesn't matter for our results. It would only change if we allow for strongly increasing returns, so that we rule out by assumption, but strongly increasing returns are very so unintuitive anyway in this context, because it would mean that you have that you can generate much more output if you produce more than in case of a constant returns production structure. So we rule this implausible parameter basically out. Now then the firms would maximize their profits in the decision of whether to employ humans or automation capital, and their profits denoted by PT omega would be the price that they can charge for the particular task multiplied by the amount of tasks that they produce. So that would be the revenue of the firm. And if we subtract the cost, which is the wage bill if the firm produces with human workers, or the cost of automation capital if the firm produces with robots, and this cost is how much capital, traditional physical capital, I need for a robot. So gamma is the physical cost, and 1 unit of capital costs the interest rate. That's the opportunity cost of capital. So this is the cost of robots. And then we can plug into this function xt omega from here and prt omega from the previous slide. So this term. And we get this expression that we have here, which is the profit function now. And what we see is that this is a strictly concave function. The reason is that this exponent here is definitely smaller than 1, because alpha is between 0 and 1 and beta is between 0 and 1. And even if beta is equal to 1, it would still be less than 1 here. That means we have a concave function here, and we subtract from the concave function a linear function. And that means the result is again strictly concave. And that in turn implies that the necessary condition for a profit maximum, the first order conditions, are also sufficient. So we do not need to check the second order conditions. We just need to compute the first order conditions in order to compute optimal employment of the two production factors, so human labor and automation capital. And that's exactly what we do on the next slide. So we do profit maximization, set the derivative equal to 0. The maximum is where the slope of the function is 0, because afterwards it flows down. And the resulting equations we can use to compute optimal employment of the firm of human labor and optimal employment of robots. And what we observe here is now very intuitive. So on the right-hand side, we see that this exponent here is negative, because alpha times beta minus 1 is negative. And since the denominator in the exponent is between 0 and 1, we know that the exponent itself is greater than 1 in absolute terms, right? So it's negative, but greater than 1 in absolute terms. And that means in turn that whenever the costs rise of human production, so when the wage rate rises, then we would employ fewer workers in the firm. That's straightforward. By contrast, if the number of assembly lines increases, we would employ more workers. And if the productivity of workers increases, we have two effects. One is that we need fewer workers to produce output, but the other is that it pays off more for the firm to invest in human workers because they have a higher productivity. And since this term here is greater than 1 in absolute terms, we know that the second effect dominates. So if we have a higher productivity, we indeed have more employment of human workers. And a similar line of argument holds true for automation capital, where automation capital decreases in the cost of automation and increases in assembly lines and in productivity. And now we have just the last step that we have to do in the choice of production mode for the firms, and that is we compute the profit levels associated with these levels of employment that we had on the previous slide. So we plug these here into the profit functions, and then we can calculate the profits of a firm that chooses to produce with humans and the profits of the firms that choose to produce with robots. And now the decision is quite clear. So the firms would compare which production mode leads to which level of profits and would choose the production mode that leads to the higher level of profits, right? So what we can then do is we can sort all the tasks in the economy according to the relative productivity of humans. So there will be tasks in the economy for which humans are relatively less productive as compared to robots. They would be produced by robots or automated in general. And we have tasks that humans are very productive as compared to robots. And these tasks will be performed by humans. So in case of the pandemic, you can think of the tasks with a comparatively low productivity, perhaps as being the ones that are then substituted by self-cash out desks and so on. And the high productivity tasks for humans would be the ones in the medical area, for example, the nose swabs that we had, delivering vaccines and so on, which could not be done by robots. So you would still have a lot of human employment in these areas. Now, if you have this range, you will have a cutoff in between somewhere. If you have this kind of sorting of all the tasks, and you have some tasks for which humans are more productive and some tasks for which robots are more productive, then there will be one task in between where the firm would be indifferent. So the two profit functions would yield the same profit. And that's the cutoff productivity task, or the cutoff productivity level. And we get this by just setting these two expressions equal to each other. And we see already that a lot drops out. So this term drops out, the alpha squared times beta drops out. We can get rid of the exponent and so on. And we have a very intuitive cutoff productivity condition that divides the two set of tasks. So what we have here is on the left-hand side, we have the relative productivity of humans versus automation capital. And on the right-hand side, we have the relative cost of the two production modes. So the wage rate in the numerator and the costs of robots in the denominator. And what we then get is that so the right-hand side is independent of the tasks. The wage rate is set at the economy-wide level, the interest rate is set at the economy-wide level, and gamma is a technology parameter. But the left-hand side depends on the tasks. So there will be tasks for which this ratio is quite low. These tasks will be automated, and the ratio for which these tasks are high, so higher than the cost ratio, they will be performed by humans. And that can be also shown graphically. So we have here all the tasks sorted according to the relative productivity of humans. Then we have the low productivity of human tasks that are automated. The high productivity of human tasks are non-automated. And in between, we have the threshold, the cutoff productivity task. And now we assume that a pandemic happens. So a pandemic occurs that shifts the infection risk at the workplace, the I, which reduces, ceteris paribus, the productivity of humans. It does not affect the productivity of automation capital. So what happens in this case is that the cut-off productivity level shifts to the right, and we have a smaller share of the tasks that are non-automated afterwards, and a larger share that are automated. So the pandemic would give a shift towards automation, but the important point here is that only those tasks that have been previously comparatively easy to automate, but not yet, it was not yet profitable to automate them for firms. These tasks and the occupations that are intensive in these tasks will be automated afterwards. While occupations that are intensive in tasks that are difficult to automate and that are located here, they are not affected whatsoever by this pandemic. And that's exactly what we can test now by means of the data in Austria. But before that, we just summarize what we've said now from the theoretical part and put this into three testable hypotheses. The first one is that automation risk reduces employment. That's just the standard result that holds irrespective of the infection risk at the workplace. But the second and the third hypothesis, they are more interesting in this context. The second says that if a pandemic occurs and increases the infection risk, this has negative effects on employment of workers, but only on those workers that exhibit a high automation risk. The COVID-19 pandemic should have no effects on employment of workers that exhibit a low automation risk or insignificant results. And that we can very well test with the data that we have at hand in Austria. So this kind of concludes the theoretical part. Of course, whenever there is a question, just let me know. Otherwise, I continue with the empirical strategy of how we test these.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry. And I was a little bit late, so perhaps I missed it.
Mm-hmm.
Are you assuming that during the pandemics, the pandemic, the change in productivity was rank preserving, that is, or there was a change also in the rank of the tasks?
Yeah, no, we don't need to assume this for the results and for our predictions, but it's a very important point. So if you go more into the details, then perhaps what you will see is that kind of exactly as I said before, there may have been some tasks, for example, in the supermarket, where there could be a very high probability to infect people, kind of, and that these tasks become then much less productive, or the humans become much less productive when you factor in infection risk at the workplace as compared to other tasks where the infection risk is not that high. So the rank could basically change, but fortunately for our results, it would not make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, please just let me know. Otherwise, I move back to the empirical strategy. So what we did was we have these three hypotheses, and now we gathered employment data for Austria. So the left-hand side is here a measure of employment, where we will see later on that we have two measures. One is a simple head count, and the other one is hours worked. And we can differentiate this between gender, skills, age, then the occupation, omega, the industry J, the region R, and the time T, where we have years before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And then we regress this measure, either the head count or the hours worked, on the viral transmission risk of the corresponding occupation omega, then on a dummy variable whether we have a COVID-19 year or not, then on the routine task intensity of an occupation omega, which measures automatability, and then crucially the interaction term between the viral transmission risk and the COVID-19 pandemic, because that's kind of what changes in our sample. So coefficient beta 4 will be crucial for testing our hypothesis. And then we have the fixed effects that we can include, and an error term that should be well behaved. And then our hypothesis would imply that hypothesis 1, that we have less employment for more automatable jobs, would imply that beta 3 is significant and negative. The hypothesis 2, that automatable jobs are affected by an increase in infection risk at the workplace, would mean that beta 4 is negative and significant, but only for those jobs that are comparatively automatable. It would have no effect on non-automatable jobs. So beta 4 should be 0 or insignificant if we run this regression on non-automatable jobs. And that's basically how we try to test these three hypotheses. And we use the data, as I said, of the Austrian microcensus from 2015 to 2021. So we have years before the pandemic and 2 years of the pandemic, basically. As I said, on employment, on hours worked, and on the fixed effects. And we construct the viral transmission risk based on a paper by Chernoff and Worman, who constructed such a viral transmission risk for the US. But we also augment this by a few components, and we particularly we do a crosswalk to the Austrian employment data from the US employment data. And we do a similar adjustment for the routine task intensity, which is based on Outdoor and co-authors from 2003. And then what we have here is the main results in terms of the empirical results, where we have two blocks of results. The first block is on employment, so where we use the left-hand side only the head count of the number of workers, and on the other is the work volume, where we really have hours worked. Now, if we look at the first one on employment on the head count, what we observe is indeed exactly in line with the three hypotheses that we had. So the routine task intensity has a negative association with employment for the automatable occupations. And particularly the interaction term between viral transmission risk and the COVID-19 pandemic has a negative sign. The size of the coefficient would imply, it's a semi-elasticity, it would imply that if we double the infection risk, we would see a reduction in employment by 7.7 percentage points. And this here, and that's the important thing, is only negative and significant for automatable occupations. It's insignificant for non-automatable occupations, and even has a positive coefficient, so a positive point estimate. So this very much kind of is some evidence on that there is a difference between automatable and non-automatable occupations. However, we can use an Austrian policy that we had to make this result strong. And this Austrian policy was that during the pandemic, we had a particularly generous furlough scheme for workers, so that firms could, if they needed to reduce production, they did not need to kick out workers. Instead, they kept the workers as employed, but with 0 hours worked, and the wage would still be paid by the Austrian unemployment insurance, or most of the wage would still be paid. So that would mean that workers were counted as employed, but worked for 0 hours. So they would show up in the work volume, but not in unemployment, right? So that would mean that if we use the work volume as a left-hand side variable, the results should be much stronger. And that's exactly what we see here. So the results for this interaction term between viral transmission risk and the COVID-19 pandemic, that doubles in size, becomes significant at the 1% level. And still we see for non-automatable occupations, there is no effect whatsoever, right? So this is still insignificant, and in addition, the point estimate is even positive. So we would interpret this as supportive evidence of our 3 hypotheses. And if we do this with work volume, then this additional story gives us additional credibility in our view that it's indeed this automation channel that matters in this context, the infection risk plus automation story. And so, I mean, these are the empirical results. We did a lot of robustness tests, but here I illustrate them for the purpose that we see it perhaps better. So what we do here is we plot employment from 2015 to 2021 for 4 different groups, and we normalize the employment index to 100 in the year 2019 for all of these groups. Now, the first group here, the solid line, that's the group that faces a high routine task intensity and a high viral transmission risk. So these are the people who face a high risk of automation and a high risk of infection at the workplace. And by contrast, the dashed line here, that's the group facing a low routine task intensity and a low viral transmission risk. So they have a low risk of getting automated and a low risk of infecting themselves at the workplace. And then we have 2 groups in between that have either a high infection risk and a low automation risk, or a low automation or a low infection risk and a high automation risk. But for the sake of illustration, we just for the moment focus on the 2 extreme groups, where we see that the group with a low infection risk and a low automation risk, they saw employment growth throughout the whole period from 2015 to 2021 without any effect of the COVID-19 pandemic whatsoever. So you don't see any change here, employment increased throughout. And by contrast, when we focus on the group with a high routine task intensity and high viral transmission risk, we see employment has been growing up to 2019, even more so than employment of the other group. But then there was a sharp change in the trend, and employment decreased again until 2021 to almost the level where it had been in 2015. So for this group, the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have made a difference. And this difference here in employment is very much in line with the coefficient size that we estimate here with the 7.72% reduction for a doubling in the infection risk, basically. So as I said, we did robustness checks, trimming the data, using different ways of clustering things stayed from the significance as they were here. We changed the VTR index and included additional components. We also changed some specifications. Nothing of that changed the results dramatically. I mean, of course, the quantitative effects were different, but the significance and the qualitative effects didn't change, which leads us basically to our conclusions that we think we can make the point that indeed the interaction between viral transmission risk at work and automation implies that there is an effect on employment in Austria. And this employment effect is only visible, so if a pandemic hits for automatable jobs, it's not visible for non-automatable jobs. And the fact that the effect is stronger for work volume as compared with the number of workers, and this is consistent with the furlough policies that we had in Austria, makes us kind of makes us confident that perhaps this mechanism that we described is indeed the one through which these changes work. And of course, there is a lot of scope for further research. So we could look at the supply of automation technologies instead as of the demand for labor, which we have done here. But as I said before, this is very difficult. So if you look only on industrial robots, then you would not see much, right? That's what the newspapers wrote in 2021, 2022. You could not see an increase in the number of robots, but that's no surprise because this needs quite a lot of time to ramp up production of industrial robots, right? So we need to look at other automation technologies, and particularly there would be questions of how do you measure AI and AI-related automation? How do you measure the kind of use of self-checkouts in supermarkets and so on? Then, of course, what would also be interesting would be results for other countries or results for Europe as a whole. We have been working a little bit on that, but ran into data problems, but we are trying to go into this direction still. And of course, what's important in this context is also the effect of work from home regulations, because they could have mitigated the employment effects to some extent. And it would be interesting to see as a third dimension, maybe, with the possibility whether you can shift your job to work from home, whether this has had a difference on our results. Of course, at the moment, we cannot do this for data restrictions, but this, I think, would be an interesting research question. So that's it so far. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope that it was interesting to you, and I'm very much